You've probably heard it before. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was 30, or maybe you heard it was 35 in ancient Rome. The number changes, but the idea is the same. People lived short, brutal lives, and then they died. If you made it to 40, you were ancient, a respected elder, a true survivor. It's a powerful image. It makes us feel good about our modern world. We have medicine. We have clean water. We live long, full lives. Our ancestors, by comparison, were just trying to survive until next Tuesday. But is that image really true? Did everyone just drop dead in their 30s? The short answer is no. Not even close. The whole idea is based on a misunderstanding of a single, tricky number. That number is life expectancy at birth. It sounds simple. It's the average age a person is expected to live to from the moment they are born. But averages can lie, or at least they can be very misleading if you don't know what's inside them. Imagine a simple village with 10 people. 5 of them die in their first year of life. The other 5 live to the ripe old age of 70. What's the average life expectancy at birth in this village? You add up all the ages at death. 5 people at age 1 is 5 years. 5 people at age 70 is 350 years. That's a total of 355 years divided by 10 people. The average life expectancy is 35.5 years. Now, does that number describe the typical experience in that village? Not at all. Nobody in that village actually died at 35. You either died as a baby or you lived a long life. The average of 35.5 is a statistical ghost. It's a number created by the math, but it doesn't represent a real life lived by anyone. This is the central problem with our image of the past. The life expectancy statistic was not dragged down by millions of 30-year-olds dying. It was dragged down by the staggering number of infants and children who never got a chance to grow up. The most dangerous time in a person's life, for almost all of human history, was their first few years. If you could just survive childhood, your chances of living to an old age were actually pretty good. A 20-year-old in ancient Rome didn't expect to die at 35. He probably expected to live into his 60s, just like a 20-year-old today might expect to live into their 80s. The world was certainly more dangerous, but it wasn't a world without old people. It was full of them. There were grandparents, there were village elders, there were old soldiers telling stories of wars fought decades ago. The myth of the 30-year life expectancy paints a picture of a world where adulthood was a brief, fleeting moment before an early grave. The reality was more of a gamble. Life in the past was like crossing a minefield. The first few steps, the years of infancy and childhood, were the most dangerous. If you made it across that part of the field, the path ahead was much clearer. It wasn't perfectly safe, of course. But the idea that the finish line was just a few steps away at age 30 is wrong. So when we see that statistic, we should not imagine a society of young adults. We should instead imagine a society that was haunted by the loss of its children. The great tragedy of the past wasn't that life was short. It was that for so many, life barely got to begin at all. The emotional landscape of the past was shaped by this reality. Parents expected to lose children, common heartbreaking part of life. Understanding this changes how we see history. It shifts our focus from the length of life to the risks of life. The struggle wasn't to squeeze a few more years out of a short lifespan. The struggle was to get through the perilous gates of childhood and into a life that could be, and often was, quite long. We need to look past that single, simple average and see the more complex human story it hides. It's a story of incredible risk, profound loss, and remarkable resilience. Let's talk more about that tricky number, the average. The concept of life expectancy at birth is a modern one. Ancient Romans didn't walk around with actuarial tables. But historians and archaeologists can reconstruct these numbers by looking at things like skeletal remains from cemeteries. When they do, they find that the average age of death is indeed low, often in the 30s. And this is where the confusion starts. The problem is what statisticians call a bimodal distribution. That's a fancy term for a simple idea. It means that instead of most people dying around the average age, people tend to cluster at 2 different points. In historical populations, those 2 points were infancy and old age. Think back to our village example. The 2 clusters were age 1 and age 70. The average, 35.5, was right in the middle where nobody was. This pattern holds true for most of human history. There was a massive spike in deaths during the first 5 years of life. Then, for those who survived, the death rate dropped significantly. It then started to climb again as people entered their 50s, 60s, and 70s. So, a much more useful question to ask is not What was life expectancy at birth? But what was life expectancy if you survived to adulthood? The answer is very different. Let's look at some numbers. In the Roman Empire, life expectancy at birth might have been as low as 25 or 30. But if a man reached age 20, he could expect to live, on average, into his late 50s or early 60s. If he made it to 60, he had a decent chance of seeing 70. This paints a completely different picture. The same is true for the Middle Ages. A life expectancy at birth of 35 doesn't mean a 35-year-old was on his deathbed. It means that for every baby born, the average outcome, factoring in all the infant deaths, was 35 years. But a 21-year-old knight who survived his first battle wasn't planning for his retirement in 5 years. He was planning for a life, a career, and a family that could last for decades. If he managed to avoid war, plague, and famine, seeing his own grandchildren was a real possibility. This is the tyranny of the average. It takes a complex reality and flattens it into a single number that hides the most important parts of the story. The key is to understand that life expectancy is not a countdown. It's a projection based on the current age. Your life expectancy at birth is one number, but your life expectancy changes the longer you live. Every year you survive, you've beaten some of the odds, and your remaining life expectancy actually goes up for a while. Let's use another simple thought experiment. Imagine a group of 100 people. In their first year, 30 of them die. That's a 30% infant mortality rate, which was common in the past. Now we have 70 people left. We've already lost 30, and this will have a massive downward pull on the life expectancy at birth for the whole group. But what about the 70 who are now celebrating their first birthday? Their prospects are much better than they were a year ago. They've passed the first great filter. Maybe another 10 die before they reach age 15. Now we have 60 people left. They are adolescents. Their chances are better still. The average age of death for this group of 60 survivors will be much, much higher than the original group of 100. This is why looking at historical figures can seem so confusing. We read about Roman senators like Cato the Elder, who died at 85, or the philosopher Plato, who lived past 80, or the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II, who was still ruling in his 90s. We see these examples and think they must have been incredible exceptions, like medical miracles. Well, they weren't. They were just the winners of life's lottery. They survived the diseases of childhood, the accidents of youth, and the dangers of adult life to reach an age that was always possible for humans. The human body has always been capable of living for 8, 9, or even 10 decades. The basic hardware hasn't changed that much. What has changed is the environment we live in and the challenges we face. The statistical shift in life expectancy isn't because our bodies are fundamentally better. It's because we've systematically removed the biggest hurdles at the beginning of life. We stopped losing so many people at the start of the race. That, in turn, pulled the average way up. But the finish line for those who ran the whole race was never at the 30-yard mark. It was always much further down the track, so if people weren't all dying of old age in their 30s, what was killing them? The world before modern medicine and public health was a far more dangerous place. The threats were everywhere, and they were relentless. The main difference between then and now is not the maximum lifespan, but the number of ways your life could be cut short at any moment. The single greatest killer, by a huge margin, was infectious disease. Today, if you get a bacterial infection, you take an antibiotic. Before the 1940s, that wasn't an option. A simple cut from a farming tool could get infected. The infection could spread to your blood, a condition called sepsis, and you would die. A sore throat could turn into rheumatic fever, damaging your heart for life. Pneumonia was often a death sentence. And then there were the great epidemic diseases. Smallpox was a constant terror, killing up to a third of its victims and scarring the rest for life. Bubonic plague could sweep through a continent and wipe out a quarter or more of the population in a few years. Cholera, spread by contaminated water, could kill a healthy person in a matter of hours. Tuberculosis, the consumption, was a slow, wasting death that claimed millions. Influenza, which we now think of as a bad flu, could be devastating, as the 1918 pandemic showed even in the modern era. Children were especially vulnerable. Their immune systems were still developing. These diseases we now consider minor childhood illnesses like measles, mumps, or chickenpox could be deadly. Diarrhea, caused by bacteria in food or water, was one of the biggest killers of infants. It would dehydrate their small bodies until they simply couldn't function anymore. This is the reality behind the brutal infant and child mortality statistics. It was a world of germs, with no understanding of how they spread and no effective way to fight them. Another major killer was childbirth. For women, pregnancy and childbirth were among the most dangerous things they could do. A mother could die from hemorrhaging, from an obstructed labor, or from infection. Puerperal fever, a bacterial infection of the uterus after childbirth, was common and almost always fatal. Midwives and doctors didn't understand the importance of washing their hands, so they often transferred bacteria from one patient to another. For every birth, there was a real risk that either the baby, the mother, or both would not survive. This constant toll on young women also contributed to the low average life expectancy. Violence was another fact of life. We may think our world is violent, but by historical standards, it is remarkably peaceful. In many societies, there was no effective state monopoly on violence. A personal dispute could easily end in a fight to the death. Banditry was common, and of course there was war. War was not a rare event, it was a constant feature of human society. And it wasn't just soldiers who died. Armies moving through the countryside would spread disease, steal food, and destroy crops, leading to famine and death for civilians. Beyond disease and violence, there was the simple danger of daily life. Work was physical and often dangerous. A farmer could be gored by an ox. A builder could fall from a primitive scaffold. A sailor could be swept overboard in a storm. There were no safety regulations. There was no emergency medical care. A broken leg could lead to a permanent disability, or, if the bone broke the skin, a fatal infection. Finally, there was the constant threat of starvation. Food production was fragile. It depended entirely on the weather. A drought or a flood could wipe out a year's harvest. When the food ran out, people starved. Famine was a recurring nightmare, and even when there wasn't a full-blown famine, many people lived in a state of chronic malnutrition. A poorly nourished body is weak. It is less able to fight off disease. It is less able to recover from injury. So malnutrition made every other threat worse. This was the world our ancestors lived in. It wasn't that their bodies were designed to fail at age 35, it was that they had to navigate a constant barrage of threats, any one of which could be fatal. Surviving to old age wasn't a biological miracle. It was a testament to a combination of a strong constitution, good hygiene by the standards of the day, and a great deal of luck. Given all these dangers, it's easy to slip back into the thinking that old people must have been incredibly rare. But they weren't. We just need to know where to look for them. History is full of evidence of people living long, full lives. The most obvious evidence comes from historical records themselves. We can read the biographies of famous individuals. We already mentioned Roman senators and Greek philosophers living into their 80s. Queen Victoria of England lived to be 81. The artist Titian was still painting in his late 80s. Benjamin Franklin was an active diplomat and inventor into his 80s. These are not isolated cases. They show that the human lifespan had a potential that was often realized. But what about ordinary people who didn't have their lives recorded in history books? We can find evidence for them in other places. Archaeologists who study skeletal remains can determine the age at death with a fair degree of accuracy. In ancient cemeteries, alongside the heartbreakingly large number of infant and child skeletons, they consistently find skeletons of people who died in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. These bones often show signs of age-related conditions like arthritis, telling us these people lived long enough to experience the physical declines of old age. We can also look at legal and social documents. Roman law, for instance, had different provisions for people based on their age, including specific rules for those over 60. Medieval contracts and wills often mention grandparents transferring property to their grandchildren. The very existence of the word grandparent in almost every language tells you that it was a common enough family role to need a name. And literature and art also reflect this reality. From ancient Greek plays to Shakespeare, old characters are everywhere. They are wise counselors, grumpy patriarchs, caring grandmothers, and foolish old men. They are not depicted as freaks of nature, they are depicted as a normal part of the social fabric. Think of King Lear, Nestor in the Iliad, or the old women telling stories and fairy tales. These characters would make no sense in a society where virtually no one lived past 40. In fact, in many societies, reaching old age conferred a special status. In a world without widespread literacy, old people were the libraries. They held the collective memory of the community. They knew the traditions, the genealogies, the farming techniques, and the stories. They were the ones who could remember the last great drought or the terms of a treaty made 2 generations ago. Their wisdom was a valuable resource. The idea of a village elder is not a romantic fantasy, it was a social reality. Elders often held positions of authority and respect precisely because they had survived long enough to accumulate knowledge. Of course, the experience of old age was different. There was no retirement. People generally worked as long as they were physically able. There was no social security or modern healthcare to manage the chronic pains and illnesses of aging. An old person was often dependent on their family for support, but the stage of life we call old age clearly existed. The mistake we make is projecting our own experience onto the past. For us, almost everyone lives to be old. It's the expected normal outcome. In the past, it was not a guarantee. It was a hard-won achievement. But it was an achievement that a significant portion of the population managed. If you were standing in a medieval market square, you would not see a crowd composed entirely of teenagers and 20-somethings. You would see babies, children, young adults, middle-aged parents, and yes, a fair number of gray-haired, wrinkled old people. They were the survivors. They had navigated the minefield and made it to the other side. Their presence was a testament not to the shortness of life, but to its persistence in the face of incredible adversity. So if people have always been able to live into their 70s and 80s, what changed? Why did the official life expectancy at birth number shoot up so dramatically in the last 150 years? The answer isn't one single thing. It's a revolution in the conditions of human life. We didn't so much extend the maximum lifespan as we built a safety net underneath the entire population, preventing people from falling off the tightrope early. The first and arguably most important change was public health and sanitation. For most of history, people lived in close proximity to their own waste. Cities were filthy. Human and animal feces would be thrown into the street. Drinking water was often contaminated with sewage. This was a paradise for bacteria like cholera and typhoid. In the mid-19th century, people started to make the connection between sanitation and disease. They built sewer systems to carry waste away. They created public waterworks to provide clean drinking water. Simply separating human waste from drinking water saved more lives than almost any medical discovery in history. People stopped dying from things we never even worry about today. The second major pillar was modern medicine. And it's not what most people think. It wasn't a sudden cure for old age. It was a series of breakthroughs that defeated the great killers of the young. The first was vaccines, starting with the smallpox vaccine in the late 18th century and continuing with vaccines for diseases like measles, diphtheria, and polio. We were able to prevent diseases that had killed millions of children for centuries. A child who was vaccinated was suddenly protected from one of the biggest threats they faced. Then came antibiotics in the mid-20th century. This was a true game changer. For the first time, we had a weapon that could kill bacteria inside the body. Infections from wounds, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and countless other bacterial illnesses were no longer death sentences. Childbirth became dramatically safer because puerperal fever could be treated. Surgery, which had always been a desperate gamble against infection, became a routine and effective procedure. Antibiotics didn't make 80-year-olds live to 120. They made 20-year-olds with infected cuts live to be 80. The third big change was nutrition. The agricultural revolution, followed by modern global trade, made food more abundant, more reliable, and more varied than ever before. Before the 20th century, the average person's diet was often monotonous and nutritionally incomplete. Outright famine became rare in the developed world. But, just as important, chronic malnutrition faded. A well-fed body is a strong body. A well-fed child has a robust immune system that can fight off infections. A well-fed adult can recover from injury or illness more effectively. Better nutrition made everyone more resilient to all the other threats they faced. These three factors, sanitation, medicine, and nutrition, work together to create a profound shift. They completely reshaped the mortality curve. The huge spike in deaths in infancy and childhood collapsed. The number of women dying in childbirth plummeted. The number of young men dying from infected wounds or workplace accidents fell. The result is the world we see today. In developed countries, it is now a shocking tragedy for a child to die. We expect to live. We expect our children to outlive us. We have pushed most of the unavoidable deaths to the end of a long life. The leading causes of death are now cancer, heart disease, and other conditions associated with aging. We are no longer fighting a daily battle against bacteria and viruses. We are fighting a long-term battle against the natural decay of our own bodies. This is the real story of life expectancy. The Great Leap Forward was not in stretching the limits of human age. It was in allowing the vast majority of people to reach those limits in the first place. The human lifespan itself hasn't changed much. A person born in ancient Rome had the biological potential to live to 80. The difference is that a person born today has a much, much better chance of actually getting there. We have not conquered death, but we have successfully postponed it for millions by taming the savage randomness that defined life for almost all of human history. The past was not a world without old people. Our world is just a world with far fewer ghosts of children.